This is Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball discussion, hosted by Inside the Hall founder and editor Alex Bozich. Since 2007, Inside the Hall has been trusted by IU fans across the globe to be the one-stop shop for IU basketball news, commentary, and analysis. Join us over at InsideTheHall.com. That's InsideTheHall.com.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. I'm happy to be joined this week by Inside the Hall co-founder, co-editor, technical support for Inside the Hall, man, Ryan Corazza. He does a little bit of everything around the site, does film session the minute after. And Ryan, I feel like this is going to be a totally different conversation than the one I had last week with my dad, Rick, where we basically picked apart some of the deficiencies of IU basketball. And now, after two straight wins over Iowa and Northwestern that were badly needed, I think, for the program, it feels like there's been a little bit of a shift. I don't want to call it a turning of the corner at this point, but at least a little bit of hope that this past week brought for fans of the program, people that follow it and care about the results, because in Indiana, it wasn't always pretty, but they figured out a way to win two games.
Well, as I always sort of say as these seasons go along, and for all these years we've been at that, I tend to render the final judgment on a season when the season ends, because there are times in January when it can feel like the season is over and all hope is lost. And there are then times later in a season where it seems like things are done in January, where in February a winning streak hits, or, they beat a ranked team, or something changes, and then it can kind of change the whole tenor. So there are a lot of ups and downs, especially in a Big Ten season. So it's kind of no surprise that there was some doom and gloom a little bit ago, and then all it takes is two wins in a row, and the tenor can change.
Yeah, I don't mean that as definitely as I use out of the woods here by any stretch, but the two games, I want to get into both of them because they both obviously were completely different. The one thing though that was a constant, I think in both, and has been the case for much of the season, is that Indiana got off to a slow start against Iowa, got off to a slow start again against Northwestern. I wanted to ask you, because you do film session and you kind of watch these games, maybe, I don't usually go back and rewatch the game very often, but I know that you do with kind of the film session work, and maybe you're looking for different things than I do when I'm watching in general. But do you have any insight or any ideas on why Indiana is consistently struggling out of the gate in games? Do you see any pattern, or do you see anything that maybe is causing this?
I honestly don't. I think that, sometimes teams just are who they are, and I'm not sure there's like a specific reason for it. I think if we look at the Northwestern game specifically, and I guess in some sense we can maybe parse this out, and this has happened in other games, but what Northwestern did defensively was really pack the paint and really, send hard doubles at both Trace Jackson-Davis and Race Thompson. And I think if you look at the beginning of that game, they're getting the ball inside, and if Trace Jackson-Davis is getting a lot of attention on him, it's kind of those shots from him that they look tough when he takes them, and they don't really come close to getting in the basket. And it kind of almost reminds me of, I want to say the Texas game was very similar to this, where Texas, is a pretty strong defensive team, and I think that's pretty much carried through all the way to now in the season as well. I think they're like a top 20 defense right now, and it's almost like when it starts like that, and when Indiana's trying to go to Jackson Davis and it's not working, it feels like it almost sort of feeds on itself, right? And I think on top of that, it was also a game where they weren't making shots, and then they were also turning the ball over a lot. And that combination was just deadly to start the game. And they weren't making free throws. So it was kind of like a trifecta there where that's kind of like the worst of what it can be is they're not as really establishing much inside early. When they're getting to the line, they're missing free throws, and then they're squandering opportunities. And that's a tough three things to try to come back from. But yeah, I don't know. It just is what it is sometimes, I guess. And if nothing else in this game, where sometimes I think earlier in the Archie Miller era, where I think maybe was that Rutgers game last year, or was that two years ago? There are some games where this stuff carries over to the second half, and they're kind of flirting with that points, one of the worst points per possession in like Indiana basketball history almost.
Yeah, it feels like we've had that happen a couple of times, because I know I've tracked it as games went on. There was a Michigan game at one point where it happened, but yeah, yesterday was the Northwestern game was kind of another one of those where the first half you were wondering, like, is this going to be the worst offensive game that they've ever had, at least in the Ken Palm era?
Yeah, but as we said right before we got recording here, that they ended up scoring. I mean, you think with the math, because they ended up at 1.0 for the game, so they really scored 1.4-ish points per possession in the second half and in those overtimes. And I think it's interesting how it was done. So I guess 2 points here. One is they didn't let this linger into the second half and overtime, which I think was good to see. And then secondarily, I think it was a case where Archie Miller teams get to the free throw line. And if you look right now, the best free throw rate in the Big Ten Conference is Indiana. Right? They're tops in the conference. They get to the line more than any other team. However, they also are converting the third worst rate in conference, 66.8%. It's 12th. Only Rutgers at 60.4% and Nebraska at 60.0% are worse than them. But so it's one of those interesting things where Northwestern, fouls a lot. And really looking back at the game, I saw, Armon Franklin was really kind of targeting Miller Kopp, especially in that first overtime. And that, he ended up, I think those 5 fouls he got, 3 of them were in the first overtime before he eventually fouled out. But it was the combination of, here's an offense that's getting to the line a lot, but then they actually converted. And you see, as everyone knows, I mean, this isn't like, some rocket science take, but if you make your free throws, you have a better chance to win the game. So it was kind of that combination of what they're trying to do on offense, but actually backing it up with a better percentage.
Yeah, that was, to me, as the game went along, the most surprising thing was how well Indiana shot free throws, considering how they started and basically how they've shot free throws all season. I think it's, I don't know that it's something you can build on, because I just, if your percentages are this bad at this point in the season, I don't know that all of a sudden you're going to necessarily become a good free throw shooting team. But I guess it was encouraging from the standpoint of they didn't let the fact that they were missing everything early. I think they started 0 for 6. And they didn't let that really carry over to the later stages of the game, where in the second half and in both overtimes, they really were able to win because of free throw shooting. I want to go back to the Iowa game for a minute, if we can. And overall, I thought in that game, they did. I think they were helped somewhat by the fact that Luka Garza had those fouls in the first half, and Fran McCaffrey. I don't really necessarily understand why he went to the auto bench with 2 fouls with a player who is going to be National Player of the Year in all likelihood. I think you have to trust him and put him back out there, just kind of based on how the game was going without him on the court. I think Fran, in many ways, kind of squandered Iowa's chances to build a bigger cushion. But Indiana was able to take advantage of his absence and get some confidence. But overall, I thought they were really excellent, again, defensively against Iowa. I mean, it was a little bit surprising for me to see how well they guarded Iowa for a second straight time. You know, the first game that they beat them in Iowa City, I looked at it and said, you know, Jordan Bohannon misses all 8 of his threes. That's not going to happen again, which it didn't. Bohannon made some shots this time, but I thought for the most part they did a really good job of guarding Garza and making him uncomfortable. I guess in your eyes, what stood out the most from that Iowa win, in, you know, holding Iowa to, I think, a season low in points per possession definitely has to be something that Indiana, you know, can look back on and say that was one of their better defensive performances of the whole season.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the defense in both of those games was really crucial. But the thing that stuck out to me the most about the second win is that, and it really happened in the Northwestern game. It was, you know, I guess you can't quite call Armon Franklin a veteran quite yet, but as a sophomore, but as an older, a little bit more experienced player, more or less. But, you know, even though those freshmen played well in that second half against Iowa, and conversely, the upperclassmen guards were shooting horrifically in that game, Archie Miller went with his veterans, I think, for defense, and they stepped up, right? Rob Phinisee hit that three-pointer. Armon Franklin, the game winner, after they had missed so many shots previously, right? And again, in the Northwestern game as well, Al Durham and Armon Franklin stepped up in a big way in those overtimes, and at the end of regulation as well, hit their free throws, you know, hit huge shots, especially, you know, Durham hit that runner at the end of regulation and hit that top of the key shot with whatever 1.6 seconds left in the first overtime to pull it even again. So it was the Iowa win was real interesting because, you know, defense was there, but the combination of the freshmen and, you know, Christian Lander starting to grow wings a little bit, although he's still kind of struggling defensively and has some turnover issues and his shooting can be a little bit spotty, but him bringing another dimension during that period in the second half and then the seniors closing it out, I thought was a pretty interesting way for them to win that game, because it really hadn't happened at any point this year where it was kind of a combination of the young guys making a good stretch in the second half and then the veterans closing it out.
Hey, it's Jared. I'm going to jump in here real quick to talk about Home Field Apparel, our friends at homefieldapparel.com. And there are several reasons why you need to go to homefieldapparel.com to upgrade your Indiana University sports wardrobe. Number one, all of their materials are so comfortable. I have the hoodies. I have a crew neck sweatshirt. I just received my LEO t-shirt that they have. And all of the materials are so soft. It feels so good against your body. And what's nice is that they still feel soft even after you wash them. Because a lot of materials, you get them, you wash them, they don't feel as nice. Home Field Apparel stuff really does. So you can count on that. Plus, they have logos there that you're not going to find anywhere else. That's kind of their thing. You know, they have over 90 different schools that they work with now. They go and find these old brand marks and logos and mascots that, you know, haven't been used in 40, 50 years, sometimes longer, and they bring them back. And so it's this great way to indulge your love of nostalgia, find these old logos that you haven't seen. And so when you go there, you'll be able to browse. I mean, for Indiana stuff, they have, you know, 2 pages worth of gear that you can see, stuff on T-shirts, stuff on crew necks, stuff on sweaters, such comfortable stuff. And it's not just IU. You know, you may have people in your life that went to school somewhere else. Sorry for those folks, but, you know, they may have. And you can find so much gear for other schools as well. And even better, you can save when you go there because our promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, will help you save 20% on your entire order. So go to homefieldapparel.com, use that promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, and get 20% off your entire order. All right, back to the show.
You know, the other thing from that Iowa game that kind of stuck out to me was just the predictable, I guess the predictable swoon now that Iowa has gone on. It seems like every year at this time in February, this team has a rough patch. And with this team, you know, this is they were, I think, at one time in the top 4 or 5 of the AP poll, were looked at as a potential number 1 seed, and now they've kind of taken a little bit of a step back, and it'll be interesting, I think, to follow them as they get into the tournament, because I don't necessarily see any time in the future that Fran McCaffrey is going to have a better chance than this to take a team to the second weekend of the NCAA tournament. He hasn't done it before at Iowa. I think there's a lot of pressure on him to do that. So Iowa's a team I think that's going to be definitely intriguing as we enter the tournament. Going back to yesterday's game against Northwestern, and we're recording this on Thursday night. So the Northwestern game, in many ways, the first half, the ugly offensive performance, no doubt about that. But you mentioned earlier how Indiana came to life in the second half in both overtimes offensively. What, I guess, stood out to you about their approach offensively in the second half and in both overtimes? Was it anything they were doing differently? Was it an adjustment, or was it just the fact that they were getting able to knock down some of those shots that they missed in the first half? I thought early in the first half, Trace Jackson Davis had a ton of looks that were just kind of point blank misses. Indiana had a lot of really decent shots, I thought, around the rim in the first half that just didn't go down. But did you see anything different maybe that they did in the second half in both overtimes, other than getting to the foul line that kind of allowed them to flip the script offensively?
Yeah, well, I think on possessions where even when Trace Jackson Davis got the ball and made an immediate move to the basket, he was able to do so unencumbered by 2 players. But I think a little bit too often he was a little bit slow to move. The double team came, and I don't think Indiana did a great job of kind of working out of those. That said, there were some 3-point looks that they got out of the double team that they just didn't drop. So that was kind of, I guess, some of those empty possessions they had. But beyond that, I think what they did really well was, like, they were getting fouled before they even got to the basket a lot. They drove off the perimeter really well in the second half and just kept picking up foul after foul after foul, which got them in the bonus, which got them to the line. So I think, obviously it's kind of a broken record at this point. They really got to the line a lot. But other than that, there were actually, some tiny adjustments, right? Like, for instance, there was that lob play for Trace Jackson Davis out of a timeout with I think 3.5 minutes left or something like that, which was smart because it got him the ball, not double team, not having to run any, pick and roll action, not having to just sit on the block. It got him moving, and it got him moving to the basket without as much defense on him. So I thought that was, it was just one play, right? But that was at least somewhat of an adjustment out of that. And also there were a few plays. Actually, I'm going to highlight this tomorrow in film session. There were about four plays or so where when Indiana, and it just, I kind of was talking to you about this during the game, but Indiana, so often it's like Trace Jackson Davis is setting this ball screen up top, and all that happens from there is Northwestern covers it the same way every time, and Indiana gains no advantage, and then all of a sudden half the shot clock is gone and they're trying to get something else going, right? And this is kind of, I think, what people have talked about with this offense in terms of its lack of predictability and, running some of this wheel action, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there were a couple times in the second half, especially, where they were able to say, okay, when Trace Jackson Davis rolls, there's one guy always helping off to make sure that he doesn't get the pass. And Indiana was finding the player that got helped off of for a sliver of opening, and then they were converting on that. They didn't convert every time. It didn't happen super frequently, but I think it happened enough where I want to say there were 2 3-pointers that happened off of. One of them was off of a Trace Jackson Davis where, I don't know if you remember that one, was the right wing where it was kind of a dangerous pass, but Phinisee threw it all the way from the right wing to the left corner, and Franklin hit a 3. And then there was another one where it actually was 2 Indiana guards that were running more of a high ball screen, and Durham popped out of that and hit a 3-point. Actually, I don't know if it was Durham got loose off of one of those two. It actually might have been another Trace Jackson Davis or a pick and roll with Trace Jackson Davis. Anyway, so what I'm saying is there were also some opportunities where if they were going to defend this ball screen at the same time, Indiana did find some slivers of space to find the open guy off of that. And sometimes hit, sometimes didn't, but at least they were knowing what the defense was doing, where there was an opening and trying it. So I think that was helpful as well as the game went along.
One kind of big picture thing I wanted to ask you about, because you've obviously been following this program just about as long as I have. I mean, when we started Inside the Hall in 2007, we've been both been following the program pretty closely for a few years prior to that. So you've seen a lot of IU basketball now for a sustained period of time, and I think kind of one of the big picture things that people are thinking about right now is the point guard position, and at what point does Indiana kind of pivot away from Phinisee and give more opportunity to Lander. I think we've seen it in small doses, but in some ways it almost feels like Phinisee, with kind of his performances lately, particularly last night against Northwestern, where he really didn't do much at all, is kind of leaving the door open for Lander to even take more of the minutes. So I guess this is kind of a two-part question, but from Phinisee, do you think this point, this late into his junior season, is it fair to just kind of say this is what he's going to be, and this is kind of what the expectation on him should be, is that he's going to be really good sometimes and then invisible other times? And two, do you see an argument that Lander needs to continue to take on a bigger role and get more minutes, or do you still see too many flaws with his game right now that are going to hold him back from being able to do that? It kind of feels like there's arguments to be made kind of to keep kind of Phinisee in his current role and kind of embrace the things he does do defensively and some of the other small things. And there's also kind of this looking ahead to the future and looking at this guy who is a really good passer, has shown really elite court vision at times, and looks like a guy that you can really build with in the future. I'm just kind of curious how you see the point guard position right now and what maybe the future holds the rest of the season.
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky, complicated thing to kind of suss out, I think, because it's clear that Rob Phinisee at this point in his career has, he's been uneven, to put it politely, I guess. And there has been some games where you almost don't realize he's out there. That said, he's a good defender. It's a team that values defense. And so I think for almost that reason alone and he's far less mistake prone, right? On defense. So almost for that reason alone, I think that's often why he is still getting the preference over Lander. But Lander does offer this more dynamic style of play. Like I think about last night's game when, again, all these high ball screens, and it's like Trace Jackson Davis, I feel like off of any of these roles, like barely gets the ball if ever. Race gets it on occasion. But when Lander's in, he's able to find Jordan Geronimo's percentage for like getting the ball in the roll and dunking, I feel like I'm probably wrong numbers wise, but I feel like he gets it at a much higher percentage and actually converts. And partly it's because he's in there when Lander is in there, and Lander he has a way of seeing the floor and throwing passes to teammates that is far and away probably best on the team. However, that also comes along with making mistakes via that. I pointed out in the film session for the Iowa game where there was that little bit of space where Race Thompson was open later in the Iowa game and during Lander's run, and it seemed like a good pass, but then it was stolen. And there were times last night where, yes, Lander had that nice, great pass, wrap around, great vision to Geronimo it was like a side ball screen off the right wing dunk. However, he also, he got into the paint and drew a little bit of defense and tried kicking it out to Leal for corner three. It was a turnover. He did something similar where I think Durham was on the right side, and again, it looks like, oh, this is going to be good, and then it's an erratic pass. So it's almost like within his ability to see stuff, I think at a pretty high level, it can be very volatile in terms of this worked and it was great, and then we kind of see what you were going for here, and it didn't quite work. Or it's a turnover, and then defensively, he's still having troubles keeping people in front of him, which is not something that Rob Phinisee struggles with nearly as much. So it's a tough kind of cocktail to, what part of Phinisee, what part of Lander you ultimately go with. But it's clear that Lander is improving, and I think I'm not sure if it's going to flip this season, but if he sticks with it and next year there's less mistakes and he's better on defense, I certainly see a scenario where he's getting more run. And what do you think about them playing together? Do you see that as a possibility, down the road for this program, or do you think that's too small of a backcourt? Or what are your thoughts on that, actually?
I would definitely try it a little bit. The thing with Phinisee that's concerning right now is this is, the most important stretch of the season. And I'm looking at his game log right now. So the Rutgers game, he scored 7 points. He was 2 of 7 shooting from the field. He had 5 assists. I guess that's okay. But the shooting, obviously not very good. Follows that up with the Illinois game where Indiana loses in overtime. He only plays 13 minutes. He doesn't score, doesn't have an assist, misses 2 of his shot attempts. Follows that up with the Iowa game where he scores 3 points, goes 1 of 8 from the field. Not good. And then last night, it was just kind of another poor performance where he didn't make a field goal, went 2 of 5 from the free throw line, had 5 assists. So, I think the thing that's been most frustrating to watch Phinisee, and I watched him a decent amount in AAU ball. I can remember going to Dallas in April of 2017, right after Archie got the job, and it kind of became apparent that they were going to recruit him. And I remember talking to him down there, watching him play a couple games, and he looked like a guy that was a pretty good shooter from the perimeter, and a guy that could spot up and make shots. And I feel like at times he's been able to do that, but for the most part, offensively, everything that he's ever gotten for himself at IU has been kind of, I don't want to say that they haven't run things for him specifically, because they have at times, but I don't think he's ever been a focal point offensively, which, he's not really making an argument for that. But I wonder if he does play with Lander, if Lander can maybe help get him some more comfortable looks, particularly from the perimeter, where I do think, I still say, and I'm probably going to, end up being wrong if his current trend continues. But you look at his, career 3-point shooting, he's only a 32% 3-point shooter. I still say he's better than that, just based on kind of what I saw as a high school player. But right now, he's 70 for 219, 32% in his career. So he's going to obviously have to make a pretty big drastic turn to change that narrative around. But I would just like to see them play together maybe a little bit from the standpoint of maybe it takes some pressure off him offensively, at least if he's not having the ball in his hands at all time, and he can maybe spot up. But another thing that's really been disappointing this year, he's only shooting 61% from the free throw line. And it's like, all right, this guy's a really good defensive player, but he's making 42% of his twos, 31.7% of his threes, and 61% of his free throws. It doesn't necessarily make you feel great about having him out there in crunch time if that's your point guard. So that's kind of been my problem just overall. You look at his year-over-year numbers, he doesn't feel like he's made a ton of progress. And I know the last 2 years, injuries were a problem. But that's kind of why I ask you if, at this point, do you just say this is what he is and he's never going to kind of take that next step? Because you listen to some of the game, like the commentaries. There's certain Big Ten BTN announcers that always are like kind of high on him, and you just wonder, like, is a breakout coming? And now that we're so late into his junior season, I just kind of wonder if it's ever going to happen.
Yeah, it's, the evidence kind of continues to stack almost through 3 years here now that it might be tough to make a significant jump. But I think you nailed it there looking at his percentages this year in terms of just shooting 61% from the line. I mean, that's among regulars. It's, other than Race Thompson, really. I mean, I guess you count Jerome Hunter, but he's only 4. He's only taken 11. I guess that's a pretty small sample size. Same thing with Geronimo. He's 1 of 9, but that's, he's less than 10 attempts. But yeah, I mean, for someone that's taken a decent amount of attempts on the team, he's, other than Race Thompson, he's pretty much the low man on the totem pole there. But you look at last season, he shot 72.5% from the line, right? So that's almost, it's like right now it's like a 10, 11% drop from the free throw line. And I think, 3-point shooting is somewhat similar. He's 33.3% last year. He's 31.7 now. And his 2-point shooting actually is a little bit better. It's at 41.8 now. It was 39.8. So the twos and the threes are pretty similar, but I think that the free throw shooting really taking a dip, especially in a year where, I mean, I guess it's kind of always been a bit of an issue in the Miller era, the free throw shooting, but to see that dip too is just, it does seem like there's just kind of a little bit of a lack of confidence right now. But that said, Miller still sticks with them, and defensively he's been good, and there was that 3 he hit against Iowa. So, I don't know if there's ever going to be some breakout from him, but it kind of is what it is offensively. And sometimes I think Miller tends to live with it because he's not giving up a ton on the other end.
One guy I feel like I haven't talked enough about this season on the show, and now that kind of where Indiana is, where they are 11-8, and you look at what this guy's done this season, and I think he's a big part of this team having success, is Race Thompson. And to me, as many limitations as he has offensively, he's still been a really reliable finisher at the rim. I mean, he's shooting almost 57% on twos, which I think is solid for a guy who's basically, undersized 4'5". He's getting to the line. His free throw rate, I know you mentioned hasn't shot it particularly well, but his free throw rate in Big Ten games, second in the Big Ten, 67.1%. And basically, for those who don't, look at advanced stats very often, free throw rate is basically measuring the number of free throw attempts you take against your field goal attempts. So it's kind of measuring the rate at which you're able to get to the free throw line. So Race Thompson's second there in the Big Ten. He's seventh, and this is something I mentioned recently in one of my 5 takeaways, 7th in the Big Ten in block percentage, which I think has been crucial to Indiana. They don't have Joey Brunk in the paint, and Trace Jackson Davis is a good shot blocker, but he's not necessarily kind of, a physical, intimidating guy at the rim. I think Race Thompson's provided a little bit of that, and rebounding. He's in the top 25 in the Big Ten in both offensive and defensive rebounding percentage. So what have you seen, I guess, the most out of Race this season in terms of improvement? I mean, I think it's pretty much across the board. I think a lot of it has to do with his health. He obviously looks more athletic, more explosive than what we've seen before. But, I just wanted to bring his name up because as much as Trace gets talked about, which is all totally justified, he's had a great year. Armon Franklin, we spend a lot of time talking about Rob Phinisee and Lander and some of the other guys. But I think Race Thompson, in many ways, has kind of been the unsung hero of this IU team.
Yeah, I think you're dead on with that. And Archie did speak to it, I think, after the Iowa game, just about just his improvement on the court, but also just as a person and how he's really matured and grown. And the crazy thing about it, and it is interesting how sometimes I think little it's talked about, but there's basically, I guess you count Geronimo as a big. I'm not sure that We should, but I think the way that he plays and the role that he plays, he essentially is. But I mean, Indiana has, without Joey Brunk, has like no front court. And I would say for the majority of the season, and I'm struggling to come up with a game where after the game, or it's a loss, or even if it was a close win, there's almost no criticism of, oh, well, our front court, we just don't have enough guys in the front court. People are getting worn down. Now on occasion, I mean, you can tell that, Trayce Jackson-Davis, I think, has been fatigued because he carries a lot of the load up there. But I don't think it's kept them out of any games. And I think because he's been so solid in kind of all the facets that's needed from him in terms of toughness, in terms of the blocks, as you said, in terms of the rebounding, and just kind of doing all of the stuff that no one else on the team can do, because they're either not equipped for it or because Indiana doesn't have enough of those type of players without Brunk and without really bringing anybody else onto the roster that does those things. So I think that's maybe the biggest thing that he has done for this team, has not made people say, oh, well, the front court has no depth, or the front court's getting killed. It's like him being able to kind of do everything at a high enough level has really kept it from not being a weakness, when I really feel like, if we think about it, I mean, there's no front court depth at all in this team,
It's definitely a weakness. It's not something that's talked about, because I think the reason it's not talked about is because Race has done such a good job, and Trayce Jackson-Davis has been so good all season. I mean, he's been in the top 10 of the Ken Pom National Player of the Year rankings basically from the beginning of the season. And he gets the headlines, he gets the attention. But as you mentioned, Race Thompson does a lot of the little things that maybe don't get the headlines, or they're not going to get any postseason accolades. But to me, he's one of the more improved players in the Big Ten, and Indiana's not anywhere close to where they are in terms of. And it's not like they're a great team, but I mean, they're 11-8, and Race Thompson is a major reason why. And as much as I think there's been a lot of criticism, some of it justified, I think, questioning kind of the player development within Indiana's program under Archie Miller so far. But I do think Race Thompson's a guy you can look at and say he's gotten better each year. And now some of it, maybe earlier in his career he was limited by injuries, but he's definitely a better player now than he was when he came onto campus. And he's the kind of guy I think that, Indiana needs more of that type of player, kind of that gritty, tough guy that will kind of just do those little things. I mean, Michigan State has won a lot of games over the years with players like that in their front court, maybe a little bit undersized bigs, but they rebound, they know how to play, and they'll dive on the floor for loose balls. So Indiana could use definitely more guys like Race Thompson. I want to,
go ahead.
No, I was,
ahead. It just made me think, in terms of player development, I think you can certainly say that about Armon Franklin as well. It's interesting, though. I think since he got that ankle injury, people have kind of forgotten how well he played earlier in the season. And to me, looking back at the film last night was a reminder of, it does seem like he was moving a little bit better last night, and he was picking up a lot of those fouls, and he was driving. And I think if his ankle can get better and he can at least be more 85-90% of what he was earlier in the year, it is, I think, helpful for Indiana's offense going forward, because he can be pretty dynamic, and he can be somebody else that can at least make something happen when nothing's happening on offense. And, I know he put in a lot of work this offseason, it seems like, but, he's someone that has taken a pretty big leap under Archie Miller as well.
Yeah, one of the other things I wanted to just ask you about or talk about here as we kind of get towards the end of the pod, Indiana's remaining schedule. There's still a lot to be determined in terms of the schedule. You look at the Ken Pom page, the projection is right now 14-11. But the thing that's not on that page is whether or not Indiana's going to play two of its road games that have been postponed at this point. At Michigan State, we don't know if that one's going to be made up. We don't know if at Michigan is going to be made up. There's obviously some time in there that last week of the regular season, February 27th, in between February 27th when they host Michigan and March 6th when they go to Purdue, where Indiana's going to have a chance to make up some games. But at 11-8 right now, 6-6 in the Big Ten, it feels like Indiana's in pretty good shape. But I think next week is arguably the most critical week of the Archie Miller era coming up. I don't, obviously anything can happen, but I don't think anyone's expecting them to go to Ohio State this weekend and win. But then you look at what they have next week at home. They've got a Minnesota team who has struggled a lot lately, a team that many people right now kind of have maybe a little bit ahead of Indiana in terms of the tournament picture overall, just based on their overall record. But I don't know that is necessarily going to continue to be the case if Minnesota doesn't figure out a way to turn around. And then you have Michigan State next Saturday at home. I know you're not a bracketology guy, but it feels like to me, and I don't mean that you're anti-bracketology, but I just mean that you're not following that stuff maybe as closely in terms of the bubble and stuff as someone that does that. But I'm curious, just what do you think Indiana is going to have to do the rest of the way to get in the tournament? It's a weird year in that all conferences obviously aren't created equal. All non-conference schedules, and I don't mean that from a conference standpoint, they're never created equal across the board, but schedules are so different this year because of cancellations and postponements. So there's not really apples to apples to compare, like in terms of league schedules, and then also the non-conference schedules were so different. But what do you think Indiana's going to need to do the rest of the way to have a chance to make the tournament?
Well, I think what would go a long way, and as we know, is one of the keys for being in the Big Ten Conference is all those opportunities you have to beat a very good quad one team, right? And they have an opportunity to do that on Saturday against Ohio State. They could have two opportunities against Michigan if one of those gets rescheduled. So, I think it could go a long way if they're able to avenge that loss to Purdue, right? So I just kind of look at the remaining teams and the remaining schedule here, and if they're able to pair these two wins against Iowa and stay 500-ish while also getting a win or two against an Ohio State or a Michigan, maybe Purdue, and not get even Rutgers has really kind of come back around again, right? And they've been playing better, although I do think they lost to Iowa last night, right? Or am I misremembering that?
No, they did. I think it was a 13-point game in Iowa City. I think they lost. So
yeah,
13 points.
Yeah, but yeah, I think if they're able to pick off another one or two wins against a one of these very good teams in conference, I think that goes a long way. And really, but it could sort of end up again as I feel like in some sense last season did, where the resume didn't wow you, but because they played in the Big Ten, because they didn't, especially this year, there's no bad loss. It might be one of those sort of backing in potentially because of a resume like that's also in play as well. And that might ultimately be what it is when the regular season ends. And, but then, and if everything works out with the Big Ten tournament as well, that's another opportunity for them to get some, potentially a quad one win. So I think it's about capitalizing another couple times on some of these good teams. And even if they, end up dropping a Minnesota or Rutgers or Purdue, if they can balance that out potentially with a win over a better team, I think that could serve them well.
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point about the teams they played and the losses. I mean, you look at their losses, they've lost 8 games, but 7 of those losses are against teams currently in the top 27 of the Ken Palm rankings. I mean, Northwestern is the only one that kind of stands out. They're 71. The flip side of that is, I mean, they've got some good wins. I think one thing that kind of hurt them was, Providence and Butler are not very good right now. Providence is 74 in Ken Palm. Butler is 99. I mean, I think when you schedule those games, obviously Providence wasn't scheduled, but it was a game that was known before the season that they were going to play in Maui and have a chance to play them. And Butler, you would expect those two teams to be a little bit better, given their recent history and the fact that they're in the Big East than what they are. I think that overall kind of hurt their non-conference, but Stanford being a likely tournament team, that's a good win. And then I think the Penn State and Maryland wins obviously count for something. And then obviously the sweep of Iowa is absolutely huge. You mentioned the Big Ten tournament. This is the last thing I want to get to, but I've kind of had a strong opinion that I'm not necessarily thrilled or I don't know that I've tweeted this or even talked about it on the podcast, but I'm of the opinion that I don't necessarily think it's a great idea to play the Big Ten tournament this year, just based on everything that's gone on and the fact that we've not we because we haven't played anything, but the teams and the players and the coaches have sacrificed all season to be able to have this season. It feels like the prudent thing to do would be to kind of just shut it down after the regular season and get ready for the tournament, because I think I would hate to see a scenario where you have teams kind of gathering in this one location and then all of a sudden you have, a couple of teams come out with COVID and can't play in the tournament. And then it's like you played this whole season and these guys kind of get that taken away from them. Do you have a strong opinion one way or the other? I mean, do you think the Big Ten tournament, obviously for money reasons, at this point it looks likely to happen, but do you, what do you think about it taking place in this season? And do you think it's kind of maybe short-sighted with the tournament, the NCAA tournament being the more important thing to actually focus on?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's one of those situations where they play the whole season. And so I get that it's close to the tournament. If these teams gather, there could maybe be, a higher likelihood, etc. But the show has gone on since the beginning of the season. As I think we've talked about on previous podcasts, like all these other sports have just soldiered ahead and have gone on. And, I do get the concern, but I just feel like it just is what it is now. And
yeah.
And honestly, it also gives an opportunity, almost like a test run, because that is going to be the site of the NCAA tournament, and they're feeling like how it is set up and structured there is apparently going to be good for COVID considerations, and they've moved it from Chicago to Indianapolis, so it almost lets them do a test run on the location before more teams come in shortly after that.
Yeah. We'll see. I mean, I don't disagree with that in terms of the show will go on, but we'll see how it it could be completely fine. I mean, Indiana could very well need those games, or other Big Ten bubble teams could need those games in order to make the tournament and ultimately punch their ticket to be in. But we'll see. We'll obviously both be continuing to follow the season the rest of the way. Ryan will have the minute after every game. He'll have a film session, and we'll continue to cover everything the rest of the way at Inside the Hall. And thanks, Ryan, for coming on the show this week, and thanks everybody for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.